Well, hello, everybody. Welcome, welcome. I'm Melissa C. I'm a recovered compulsive overeater. I am in New York and happy to be here. Happy to be back. I wasn't here last week and just always good to be here and be with all of you. So, for those of you who are new and you maybe not met me before, I have recovered from compulsive eating and compulsive food behaviors. At one time, a little backstory about me. I lived constantly dieting, constantly struggling with the food. It was a battle all the time. And yet, even though I lived my life on diets and I had plenty of information about what a healthy diet was and what I could and could not eat, I was over 300 pounds when I came here. So all the knowledge that I had about diets and all the knowledge I had about my own problem with certain foods, I could do nothing about it until I surrendered and worked this program and followed directions and formed a relationship with my creator. And so in that time, it's been over 11 years now. I've been relieved of over 160 pounds. I do not diet. I do not struggle with eating compulsively. I don't think much about food. I eat very peacefully and abstain from the things I can't eat very peacefully. And so, and that's available for anybody and everybody who follows these directions and forms their own relationship with God. So, the chapter I'm going to go through tonight is called More About Alcoholism. And I, I think this chapter could actually be called More About How We're Crazy, or even better, more about why we need God, why it is I need God. And what the chapter is going to be doing is it's going to go through story after story. And in each story, what is happening is that the doors that we thought might be the way out, well, each story closes that door and then locks it. And so that at the very end of the chapter, we are left with the only door, and that's to a higher power. And in the chapter previously last week, Janet went through there's a solution. There's a part that talks about reaching the bitter end, right, from which there's no escape through human aid. And you reach the bitter end, you have two alternatives. One, go to the bitter end, blotting out the consciousness, and the other one is to accept spiritual help. And now further, More About Alcoholism is going to explain to you and to me why we really need spiritual help. It's going to like drive it home. So in page 30, the first paragraph is going to tell us what our great obsession is, because you often hear, I have an obsession, I have an obsession. Well, now it's going to tell me what is the great obsession. Well, here it is, the idea that somehow, someday, he will control and enjoy his eating. That's what I say, my eating, my food. That's the great obsession of every abnormal eater, every abnormal drinker. And the persistence of this illusion is astonishing. Many pursue it into the gates of insanity or death. So, one of our biggest problems is that we don't think we have a problem.
Mhm.
And in fact, we are persistent about keeping up this illusion. Despite all the difficulties, we continue to live trying to prove a false idea. And that's got a name. It's called denial. When you don't believe you have something, despite all the evidence, you deny that you have the problem, that's denial. So now in the second paragraph, it's going to tell us the first step to getting well. We learned we had to fully concede to our innermost selves that we were alcoholics. This is the first step in recovery. The delusion that we are like other people, or presently maybe, has to be smashed. So we have to know this. We have to admit it. And the diagnosis has to come from within. cannot be diagnosed by another person. We have to know it. We've got to admit it, which is really why we never try to convince others that they have this problem. The disease does the convincing. So when I meet somebody and they say, I'm not really sure I have this problem, I do not agree to sponsor them, because you cannot agree to sponsor somebody who has not admitted that they have a problem. Now, they're welcome to meetings. They can come to any meeting at any time. We always welcome them, even when they're not 100% sold that they have this problem. But if they want to stop eating compulsively, we say that's the only requirement for membership. But that is not the requirement for working the 12 steps, right? So the third paragraph now tells us some of the characteristics of the disease. Because if I'm going to identify and fully concede to my innermost self, I have it, I need to know what some of those characteristics are. Well, it's permanent and progressive. And here it says, no real alcoholic ever recovers control. So that's permanent, never recovers. We are in the grip of a progressive illness. It gets worse, never better. And here's my own experience. My binges got longer. They lasted longer. They required more food. They happened, not only did they last longer, they happened more often. The time in between got shorter and shorter. And the time in between my binge were harder to tolerate. I couldn't tolerate not eating. There was a time that, I remember when I was in junior high, um, I had like a group of little friends, and we would hang out and we would have Friday night sleepovers. And we would call them, I remember this so well, we called them pig out parties. We were going to pig out. And we would order, a pizza, and there would be ice cream, and someone would bake cookies. We have all these treats, right? And I started that way on Friday night binges, but that was so exciting, intoxicating. Like, it did something to me that those binges did not just happen on Friday nights for me. That suddenly became, I could do this more often. I could do this by myself. I didn't need my girlfriends to do this. And I remember at these parties, my friends would pass out. They would all go to sleep. And I would still be up, or I would wake up and go back for more. Um, you know, at first, what happens is, we fit the binging into our lives. And then we try to fit our lives around the binges. And then our lives are just the binges. That was my whole life. Page 31, the second paragraph begins to list the methods, right? So it's good to note, if I have this problem, chances are I might have tried some of these methods to convince myself I don't have this problem. And methods are what we use to manage and control a disease. They're also what we use to support the delusional thinking that we can control this. So, for most of us, methods are diets, right? That's the common method. We would do a diet, weight loss and weight control plans, gym memberships, insane diet, and exercise regimens. And I always tell people, like, if you've tried a lot of methods, list your own, list them, make a list of all your methods. And I'll tell you what amazes me when I started listing my methods. First of all, I'm amazed by how many I tried. I tried some of the craziest things. And not only did I try them, but I actually would retry them. They were so lousy and unsuccessful the first 10 times, I tried it 11, 12, 13 times. Just kept retrying things. And so for me, it also shows me that lack of desire was never my real dilemma. Because sometimes you meet people and say, oh, she doesn't want it bad enough. And I remembered people kind of, and there were times in my life I didn't want it bad enough, but there were other times when you bet I wanted this very badly. So it wasn't a lack of desire, you know, nor was it a lack of information. because I wanted to stop very much. And I knew precisely the foods that were problem foods for me. And all of these methods, all the methods that I tried were extremely effective so long as I followed them, right? Except I can't follow them. Diets work until they no longer work. And then I could never rework them quite the same way again. I always think about it like this, when I dieted, it was like trying to fence a dog. And if you've had a dog and the dog figures out how to get out of the fence, you're going to have to find either another fence or patch that fence up. But I kept putting that dog back in the same fence and wondering why it wasn't going to work, right? Because diets don't work. It's like trying to fence a dog. Now the bottom of page 31, all the way to the top, says it does this. It's going to give us a way to diagnose the illness. And here's a question. Can you control your eating? Can you eat the foods that are problematic foods in moderation? Can you moderate? Can you do it consistently? You know, can you do it over a long period of time? And by the time we get here, we know the answer. No, we cannot. Most of us come in because that experiment was a disaster. We tried that. Of course we did. If I could have, I would have. I would have found another way for sure. Okay, so now the chapter is going to give us 4 examples to help us determine some things and to bring to life some important concepts. And they're going to give us these 4 examples, and here they are. 1, the man of 30. 2, Jim. 3, the Jaywalker. And 4, Fred. So here's 4 examples. Now, the bottom of page 32 is the man of 30. Okay, this is an excellent example of the characteristic of this disease. Remember, we're going to identify some of the characteristics. This disease is patient because it says here he stopped drinking for 25 years. In fact, it says he remained bone dry. Clearly, he had exceptional willpower and self-discipline, right? He wanted to be successful in his life, in his career, and he called upon his willpower to leave the liquor alone so he could meet his goals, right? Reach his goals. I think it's also important to point out in this story, as well as the other ones that we're going to discuss, is that this man of 30 did not accidentally trigger an allergy. Sometimes I hear people say, oh, I binged because I accidentally triggered an allergy. Now, that might happen, but in these examples, this is not an example of someone who accidentally did anything. In fact, he was very careful, you know, and he was able to remain bone dry, for 25 years. So we can know that entire abstinence is important, but knowing it is not insurance or protection, or even having it. Long term abstinence, long periods of sobriety does not keep you sober, right? So you can make up your mind and rely on your mind to stay made up if you do not have this problem. If you have this problem, at some point, your mind will not stay made up, right? And if we're addicted, right, we cannot regulate and control. So what happened for him was he picked up, he started drinking, and then he tried. He was like, oh, this is a problem. Let me see if I can regulate it and control it. And for me, I have a real example of my life. I have my honeymoon story where I had been abstinent for years without working the steps. But I found out about the allergy of the body. And just like this guy, I had dreams and goals. For me, I wanted to meet a man. I wanted to get a good job, get married, leave my parents' house, get a life, right? And I put the food down and I got all those things. And then on my honeymoon, I looked around and I looked normal. I was in a bathing suit in a pool on my honeymoon. And I looked around and I saw other honeymooning women my age. I was a kid, I feel, in the pool. And I was like, They were drinking gorgeous frozen tropical drinks. And I say it was like an ice cream sundae in a glass. That's what it was. And I thought, of course I can do this. Look at me. I'm a normal person. And I picked it up and it was worse than it was earlier. And then all my honeymoon long, I didn't try to regulate and control it because I was enjoying it. I didn't know I was powerless. We had a great time. We had a great time. At the end of my honeymoon, none of my cute clothes fit me. I don't even know what I wore home on the plane, but nothing fit. And then I thought, all right, well, it's Monday. And I had a food plan. I say back then, my God was abstinence. That was the God I worshiped. And my food plan was the religion I practiced to have a relationship with that God of abstinence. That is not God. That is not a higher power. And so that Monday, I went to the store and I bought all the foods that I needed because I knew what I needed to eat to stay abstinent. And they rotted in my fridge. And week after week after week, I kept doing that and then eating takeout and eating drive-throughs and going to the bakeries. And before long, I was not a thin married person. I was obese again, just like that. And so it says here that every means of solving his problem, which money could buy, was at his disposal, and every attempt failed. Okay, I spent so much money. I probably, I don't know, I could have a yacht and a mansion if I had taken that money and done something else with it. I spent money constantly. And I also had this false belief. This shows how insane I am. I'm pretty logical in many other areas. But if it was super expensive and sounded ridiculous, I thought it was a brilliant idea and I'd be all in. I loved the crazy notions that cost a lot of money, right? And every attempt failed. So, what's the lesson here? If you're planning to stop drinking, there can be no reservations of any kind, nor any lurking notion that someday we will be immune to alcohol. So, although we say one day at a time, that's common, right? We all say one day at a time. We mean we live in freedom each day, only taking on the day that we're living. But I've gone on many, many vacations since that honeymoon. And I have looked around and seen other normal looking people drinking drinks, and I have not fallen prey to the delusion that I'm like other people just because I'm on vacation today. Why is that? Well, we'll find out at the end of the chapter why that is. All right, page 34, the middle of the first paragraph. If you're questioning if you've entered this dangerous area, the area where you're unable to quit on your own willpower. That's the dangerous area. Well, it says try leaving it alone. So if you're not sure, they say, all right, well, try to leave it alone for a year. This is another way we can determine if we are in fact powerless. And we find this out not so much when we're having fun and we don't want to stop. When you find out you're powerless, not while you're out there binging, wanting to eat, when you're out there binging, not wanting to eat. That's how you know you're powerless. When you really, really want it and you can't do it. I knew I was powerless, not while I was on that honeymoon, but when I came home and had all the healthy food in my fridge and I couldn't eat it. That's how I knew I was powerless. So, from this point on in the chapter more about alcoholism, it's going to try to help us determine if we can quit on our own or if we are, in fact, someone who's going to require something beyond human power. Remember, the purpose of this chapter is to convince those that need convincing that they're going to need God, right? So it's going to do this by describing, and here it is in the top of page 35, the mental states that precede a relapse into drinking. For obviously, this is the crux of the problem. So, what is the crux of the problem? The thinking that precedes the relapse, that comes before picking up. Something happens before, and that's what we're going to look at. So, the crux of the problem is the most important part. And what's the most important part of our problem? Is our thinking. And it's going to do this now by giving us three more examples. We're going to drill down in on these three examples to think about our thinking. One is Jim, two is the Jaywalker, and three is Fred. So here's Jim, page 35. He was smart, he's likable, he's got a beautiful family, inherited a business. So he's got this beautiful life. You know, sometimes I hear at meetings people talk about the horrors of their childhood, and that's why they're a compulsive overeater. And maybe that's true, and maybe it's not. But I have to tell you, I had a beautiful childhood. I had a loving family. My parents adored me, you know, and I had a good husband, had a good job, had lots of wonderful things, and yet my eating was destroying it all. He was motivated to stop and was told about alcoholism, and he made a start, meaning he started on the road to recovery and his life started getting better. And again, here's the important part: he failed to enlarge his spiritual life. Basically, what that means is you got to have a spiritual life in this program. And we learn, how do we enlarge our spiritual life? Through work and self sacrifice for others. So it's probably safe to say he really wasn't doing much of anything for anybody else except for himself. Most likely, he was really focused on himself. And, you know, if your spiritual life does not grow, think about it. If you've got a permanent and progressive illness, which means a problem that is not going away and is getting bigger, my spiritual connection must get bigger as well, must continue to grow. You know, and we've been told in the chapter that came before that this is a spiritual solution. So my solution has to get bigger. Um, and I also want to drill the point that when Jim picked up, I think this is so important for us, he was not dropped and cast aside. And the reason he picked up was not because he triggered the allergy, but like the man of 30, he was sober. In our case, he was abstinent. He picked up because he was not living safe and protected. He had not grown his spiritual life. In the bottom of page 35, here it says, he found himself drunk half a dozen times in rapid succession. I want those of us that are sponsoring to listen closely. On each of these occasions, we worked with him, reviewing carefully what had happened. So here's this guy. Imagine you're sponsoring this person, right? And he picks up 6 times in a row, rapid succession, like maybe gets a day or two, maybe gets a little bit, and he picks up again, and he picks up again. And what did they do each time? They worked with him, carefully going over what happened. I gotta tell you, it is not fun. It is the hardest work of sponsoring, working with someone who's doing well and picks up, right? And who does seems to do it countless times. Does it again, does it again, does it again. And here's what I'm going to tell you. If you really believe that you're powerless, if we really believe that our sponsees who pick up half a dozen times are powerless, how could you be cruel or punishing or dismissive to somebody who has no power. That would be like, I just got over COVID, right? If my husband got angry at me because I snored away the whole week so that I couldn't breathe, right? And he wasn't like, you are the worst wife in the world. I just wish you'd be quiet already, right? I couldn't help it. It was a symptom. I had no power against it. It's a disease, it was an illness, and I couldn't do anything about it. If I started coughing uncontrollably or sneezing and I was supposed to be quiet, you can't get angry at somebody who has no power. But we're supposed to help. And here, they helped him at least half a dozen times on rapid succession, not just saying, all right, back to step one with a lot of you, back to the beginning with a lot of you. But it doesn't say he went back to step one all over again. It says, carefully went over exactly what happened. And I would say, carefully reviewed the mental state, because we know it's always the mental state that preceded. So I would imagine they carefully talked to him. All right, what was going on in your life at that time? What happened right before? What were you thinking? What, right? That's how we helped one another. So I don't just let people say, well, I ate off plan again and I binged again. I actually press them for the details. Let's get in there. Let's look at the details. Why? Not because I want to do finger pointing and shame people and say, see, you were a naughty girl. Because I don't want it to be repeated again. Because I want to help them identify what it is so that they can do something about it the next time. So I think it's good. Let's do this with Jim. Let's carefully review what happened. Well, he had words with his boss. Bing. Like, we can't be having words with people. Remember, we're not supposed to be fighting with people. Obviously, he had a resentment. He went to a bar to get lunch and a customer. Okay, he was already in trouble. I would have said to him, wait a second, you what? You did what? You got mad at your boss and you went to the bakery? Like, what were you thinking? Why would you do that? Right? That's not really wise. He needed to do anything other than that. And we can say that he's off track well before he went into that bar. Our text tells us, right? We can go anywhere provided we are in fit spiritual condition. Well, we also know he hadn't enlarged his spiritual life, so he wasn't in fit spiritual condition. And we know that, how do we get spiritually fit? Work and self sacrifice. Well, if he wasn't helping anyone yet, then I can assume he had not worked through the steps and he wasn't sponsoring. And I would say, for my sponsees, people I work with, I'd say, well, you're in that hospitalization period. You don't belong in a bar. You don't belong in a restaurant if you can avoid it. You don't belong in those places because you're very vulnerable. He's sitting there, right? He's having sandwich after sandwich, milk after milk. And here's where it gets clear that Jim has an alcoholic mind. Middle of page 36. Suddenly, the thought crossed my mind that if I were to put an ounce of whiskey in my milk, it couldn't hurt me on a full stomach. I ordered the whiskey, right? Here he is. He's ordering the whiskey, he's putting it in the milk. And he vaguely gets this sense, I'm not being any too smart. But he felt reassured that he was, as he was taking the whiskey on a full stomach. Okay, like we know that's just delusional thinking. This is a clear example of foolish thinking. So we cannot rely on our own thinking. We lie to ourselves, and so we believe it. Of course, we believe it because we created the lie ourselves, right? I know exactly what lie I'm going to believe if I'm the one making up the lie. Bottom of page 36 to the top of 37, he had much knowledge about himself as an alcoholic. Yet reasons for not drinking were easily pushed aside in favor of the foolish idea that he could take whiskey if only he mixed it with milk. And then I love the next couple of sentences because for me, it helps define insanity. Sometimes people don't really like when they say restoration to sanity. They're like, "Well, I'm not insane." What do you mean I'm insane? Well, here's a great definition. Whatever the precise definition of the word may be, we call this plain insanity. For how can such a lack of proportion of the ability to think straight be called anything else? So, insanity is lacking proportion. For our purposes, it means not having proportionate thinking. What does that mean? Minimizing the importance of certain things and making other things more important than they should be, right? And so I would say in this example, minimizing the importance of staying sober over the importance of getting a customer. One is his life, right? And the other one is the possibility of a customer. So for me, here's an example of lacking proportion. If I'm going to a, someone's house and I'm afraid of offending the host, so I don't ask what they're serving and I don't ask what's in what they're serving because I don't take, now I know I have an allergy. I just explained to you, I've known it from the time I could remember. But if I'm more afraid of asking, of offending my host than I am of setting off a deadly allergy, I lack proportion of the ability to think straight. And I'll tell you this too, I'm a teacher, and every year I get a kid or two who has a peanut allergy, and their parents do not lack proportion. They have they're not afraid of offending me. They're not afraid of offending the whole school. They will demand, and rightly so. That's the life of their child. And they take it very serious. They're not worried about upsetting anybody because they're talking about their kid's life. Well, how about us? This is my life. Why would I lack the ability to think proportionately about my own life? Because it's a form of insanity. Because I have a form of insanity. And here it says, page 37, it describes how consequences and sound reasoning are not able to help us. We have sometimes reflected more than Jim did upon the consequences, but there was always the curious mental phenomenon that parallel with our sound reasoning, there inevitably ran some insanely trivial excuse for taking the first drink. Our sound reasoning failed to hold us in check. The insane idea won out. So it talks about like this running alongside. So I kind of like to envision it like a race, right? On one side, one lane is sound reasoning, and running up against it is the insane idea. Now they can run neck and neck, and then when propelled on my own human power, I am no match for the insane idea. It always wins the race. Remember, it's a patient adversary. And I'd say it like this: it can run the marathon. It can run, if you remember the man of 30, for 25 years alongside. You might be thinking you're winning, but at the very end, it overtakes you on your own power. On page 38, now we're going to look at the Jaywalker. All right. And what does a Jaywalker teach us? I don't know, stay out of traffic. It sounds like a crazy thing. I always would read this for, and I'm like, that is crazy. But, you know, I think it's this exactly. You would expect him, if he were normal, to cut it out. Okay, we're not normal. I think that's like the big lesson here. We are not normal, right? We also learn that promises don't work because he makes promises, and promises don't work, nor does being ridiculed. He was ridiculed by this disease, by what happened to him, by being hit over and over again. Normal people can generally make promises for the most part and keep them. I've been able to make promises in many other areas of my life and keep them. I'm like a pretty, sincere person in many other areas of my life. If I say I'm going to be someplace, most of the time I would show up and be there. However, add food to the equation, I cannot keep a promise, right? So if you look at the doctor's opinion, it says recovered people's words are reliable. You can keep your word, but not so with those who are still in the clutches of the illness. Because if food is your master, it doesn't care about broken promises. It's your master. Page 39, the actual or potential alcoholic, with hardly an exception, will be unable to stop drinking on the basis of self knowledge. And we're going to read about Fred to illustrate this point now. All right, Fred, he's living a beautiful life, happy home, great marriage, promising kids, successful in business, and well liked. So you don't have to be living in a visible mess. You don't have to have a horrendously awful life and say, that's why I eat. No, you can be, you can look quite well. You can present yourself quite well, and you can have no other notable problems. Fred, however, wound up in the hospital. And although he was embarrassed by what had happened to him, he didn't even admit what the problem was at all. In fact, he said he was there to rest his nerves. He was a long way from admitting that he had a problem. He was depressed about his drinking, and so he made up his mind to quit drinking altogether. He didn't believe he was an alcoholic. No step one. And he did not have step two for sure, right? He didn't accept a spiritual remedy for this problem. He didn't think he needed a spiritual remedy for this problem. He didn't think he had a problem. Top of page 40, he was positive that his humiliating experience, plus the knowledge he acquired, would keep him sober for the rest of his life. Self knowledge would fix this. So, if humiliation would have worked, you know, when I was in high school, I gained 100 pounds. There is nothing more humiliating than gaining 100 pounds in your teen years, except gaining 100 plus pounds in your early marriage. So humiliation didn't work, never worked, nor did self knowledge because I knew what I shouldn't eat and I could not do anything about it on my own power. We all know that that was a failure for him as well. And we're also told that everything went great with Fred. He exercised willpower and thought he could stay on guard. Willpower is an unreliable power source for us. So remember, we are closing the door. With each story, we keep closing the door on the things we thought were going to help. So now you can close the door on willpower because willpower has an unpredictable expiration date. It is not like the carton of milk in my refrigerator. It is not stamped when it expires. All of a sudden, it's no longer available, gone. And for me, it was always at the times when I needed it the most. I just did not have willpower anymore. And here's the problem, it talks about staying on guard. Well, here's the greatest problem with staying on guard. Who's the guard, right? It's like putting the wolf in charge of guarding a picnic basket. Like, I can't stay on guard. I'm the problem. In the middle of page 41, Fred is describing that experience of crossing the threshold into the dining room. And he thinks here, oh, it would be nice to have a couple of cocktails with dinner. And I think, it's so similar to the story told in the chapter A Vision for You, where Bill has the similar thought. He thinks, perhaps he could handle, say, three drinks, no more. But instead, we know in Bill's story, in A Vision for You, Bill recoiled and he made a call looking for someone he could help, right? Because He had a practice of self sacrifice. He was growing spiritually. Fred did not have that. And Fred did not do that. So Bill, who by the way had a business deal go south, he did not go drink. And Fred, whose business went off well, did drink. So, we know again that circumstances and having everything go my way, well, that doesn't keep me sober either, right? And it says again here, not only had I been off guard, I had made no fight whatever against the first drink. This time I had not thought of the consequences at all. I had commenced to drink as carelessly as though the cocktails were ginger ale. Here's part of the insanity. We truly cannot protect ourselves from danger because the things that are dangerous to us seem harmless. It didn't seem like it was a big deal. He thought it was like just like having a ginger ale. On the top of page 42, it's going to be repeated again. Willpower and self knowledge will not help in those strange mental blank spots. And at this, Fred was crushed. Now, here the two members come to see him, and they're in the hospital and they're smiling. Why? Why are they smiling? Well, I don't think it's because they're sadistic. I don't think they had pleasure in seeing him so beaten, but they're there to help. And we learned right in the beginning of this chapter that we have to fully concede before anything can be done to help us. And I love how we're being shown exactly how we carry the message. They asked him if he thought himself alcoholic and if he was licked. And when he said yes, they did not start cheering him up. They didn't say, "Oh, good. Now that you've admitted you're licked, now that you admitted you're powerless, awesome. Everything's going to get better for you now. See, you admitted it." In fact, they told the truth that this was a hopeless condition and talked about their own sufferings. You know, when they talked about their own sufferings, that actually was how they delivered hope. Because here they were visibly no longer suffering, but the words they told were about their suffering. And it got him interested. That's what gets people interested. And the importance for him, I think why they were smiling in the hospital is because he was ready. I love nothing more when I meet people in this program. I say it's like they're at that sweet spot. They are done with negotiating, they're done with arguing. It's almost like you hardly have to sponsor them at all. You kind of give them directions and they do it, they do it, they do it. Why? Because they fully conceded. And when given the right directions, they're willing to take it. So, bottom page 42 to the top of 43 says this. Here's one of my favorite promises: spiritual principles would solve all my problems. I have since been brought into a way of living infinitely more satisfying and I hope more useful than the life I had lived before. My old manner of life was by no means a bad one, but I would not exchange it for the best moments for the worst I have now. I would not go back even if I could. And that's his experience. And I have to say that's mine as well. No matter what difficulties I have faced in recovery, in being recovered, in abstinence, in having a relationship with God, I would never trade for the best moments of the past. Every single problem I experience today can be solved through the spiritual course of action. The steps are the pathway to God. And if you told me tomorrow that I could eat whatever I want and never have to do all the things I have to do to live in freedom from the food, I actually would refuse the offer because I no longer do the things because I'm told I have to. I actually do the things in this program because I want to, because I like what it gets. I have a friend that says, The work is hard, but the pay is great. That's the truth. The work is hard, but the pay is phenomenal. Bottom of page 43. Once more, the alcoholic at certain times has no effective mental defense against the first drink. Except in a few rare cases, neither he nor any other human being can provide such a defense. His defense must come from a higher power. So, I had an interesting conversation about the group as a placeholder for God, right? And it actually says here very clearly no, no. No other human being can provide such a defense. Now, the benefit of the group, the benefit of the fellowship is you are meeting people who have close relationships with God, who are striving to have that relationship with God. And there is something definitely spiritual that occurs when you're in the company of others who are also reaching along a spiritual path, but it is not in their power that is giving you the power. It is their power that is enticing you, that is encouraging you, that right is I would say is whetting your appetite. So when we work with people who are spiritually along this path, here's what happens. I call someone in this program because I'm pissed off about X, Y, and Z. Let's say I'm mad at my sister about something. And people that are working this program looking to have a relationship with God do not say that lousy, rotten sister of yours or that terrible brother of yours. They help me reach out to God, right? That's what this says. So, no human power can provide such a defense. The defense must come from a higher power. So, here it is. The chapter closes and locks all the other doors. And it ends with that one door that's available to me. The only thing that can save me. It tells me in step one in the AA 12 and 12 that only an act of providence, only an act of providence. And an act of providence is the miracle of God's healing power. So when I say to you, I can go on any vacation and be surrounded by people drinking beautiful frozen tropical drinks and think nothing about it. I can actually feed my mother ice cream and think nothing about it. It's not because I have willpower. It's not because I remember how bad eating was. It's not any of those other things we talked about. What is it? It is the relationship with God. And with that, I'll pass. Thanks.